So now we're going to derive sine and cosine for 150 degrees. So if you locate 150 degrees on your unit circle, we're going to create a right triangle. So I'm going to create a perpendicular line right here. And if you'll notice that the reference angle here is 30 degrees. So I'm going to make this 30 degrees because our reference angle is also 30. 150 is 30 degrees away from 180. So we know that our hypotenuse is 1, which is also the radius. However, if you recall from a previous lesson, the side that is opposite 30 degrees is always half that of the hypotenuse. So this is 1/2. And by the Pythagorean theorem, we would have obtained that the side that's opposite 60 degrees is the square root of 3 divided by 2. So when we perform our cosine ratio, cosine of 30 degrees here would be adjacent over hypotenuse. So the cosine of 150 degrees is equal to the square root of 3 over 2 divided by 1, which is simply the square root of 3 over 2. Now for sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So the sine at 150 degrees is 1/2 divided by 1, which is simply 1/2. However, notice where we are. Since we are in the second quadrant, our x values in the second quadrant are negative. So we're just going to put a negative there. That doesn't mean the side is negative, but the negative is used as a way of determining where you are in terms of the unit circle. So negative rad 3 over 2, that would make cosine here negative rad 3 over 2. And if you'll notice from our previous slide, that would be the coordinate right here, rad 3 over 2, negative rad 3 over 2, 1/2. So now let's move on to 240. Now for 240, we're going to be right here. So I'm going to make a perpendicular line over here. And the reference angle here is 60 degrees. So if I were to make a reference angle, notice these two have point symmetry. So this is really 60 degrees. Again, this is 1 because it's in the unit circle. So if this is 60 and this is 90, this side here must be 30. And the side that's opposite 30 is half of the hypotenuse. So this is 1/2. And this side over here, by way of the Pythagorean theorem, would be the square root of 3 over 2. However, since we are in the third quadrant, both x's and y values are negative. So I'm going to put negatives in front there. So now we have cosine of 240 degrees is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse, and in this case it would be negative 1/2. And sine of 240 would be negative square root of 3 over 2 divided by 1. So now let's move on to the circle that is 315 degrees. So for this particular angle, the reference angle is 45 degrees. Notice the 45, so I'm going to also draw 45 degrees here. This is still 1. Now from a previous lesson we derived that when you have an isosceles right triangle and the hypotenuse is 1, your sides would be the square root of 2 divided by 2 and the square root of 2 divided by 2. However, since we're in quadrant 4, your y values are negative, so I'm going to put a negative in front there. So cosine of 315 degrees is the square root of 2 divided by 2 over 1, which is just the square root of 2. And sine of 315 is equal to the negative square root of 2 divided by 1, which is the negative square root of 2. Again, it still follows that as coordinates, this would be the square root of 2, rad 2, and negative square root of 2 over 2. So now we get to 270. So at 270, if you'll notice, we have no triangle that is formed because there is no movement horizontally. So since there's no movement horizontally, there is no adjacent side. So your adjacent side here, cosine of 270, your adjacent over your hypotenuse, well, there's no adjacent side, so it's 0 over 1 because the hypotenuse is still 1, and your answer is 0. However, for the sine values, since this is the unit circle, this has a length. Your opposite side, if we were to look from a reference angle, your opposite side would have a distance of 1. However, since we're in between quadrants 3 and 4, and sine is, your y values are negative there, sine of 270 is negative 1 divided by 1, which is negative 1.